In the peaceful fishing village of Baltimore on the southwestern coast of Ireland, the residents were fast asleep. It was the early hours of June 20th, 1631. That day would have been like any other, mending nets, repairing boats, catching and salting fish. At that time, there was a massive fish trade with, in particular, Spain, France, and Portugal. But lives were to change forever that night. 2 ships had left Algiers a few days before, and they were under the command of the notorious renegade Dutchman Murat Rees the Younger. Having docked at a nearby cove 2 hours before dawn, 230 men armed with muskets, iron bars and firebrands landed at the village. They broke down doors and set dwellings on fire. The population must have been terrified, pulled or burnt out of their beds, and in the scuffles, 2 were hacked to death. Others escaped, but 109 men, women, and children were abducted. Their destination? The slave markets of Algiers. That dreadful night did produce some heroes. One of them was a Mr. William Harris.
Yeah, so he was up on high ground as a observer watchman and spotted the pirates approaching, and as a consequence what he did was he alerted several people who lived not down on the shore but slightly further inland, and they used their weapons to simulate an armed force in position to defend the town, and it discourages the pirates from coming further inland. So they only actually take the people from the settlements right down at the shore, and the higher regions are untouched. And part of the reason for that seems to have been the quick thinking of William Harris.
Were there any attempts to bring the slaves back? Were there any petitions or campaigns to rescue them?
So we know that Richard Boyle, the Earl of Cork, was approached several times, both about these captives and about other cases. We don't know how seriously he pursued it. What we do know is that there was a woman who apparently was from Baltimore who was actually ransomed in Livorno in Italy in 1633. That may have been through the agency of her family. And then the most significant intervention was at the behest of the English Parliament in 1645, when representatives in Algiers released something like 240 odd prisoners from England and Ireland. And amongst them there were 2 women from Baltimore, so Ellen Hawkins and Joanne Broadbrook were released at that point, and they were brought back to England, and what happened to them after that is some degree of speculation about, but they don't appear to have returned back to Baltimore itself at any stage.
There is very little information about the individual fate of the Baltimore captives, but there is a written record of their arrival in Algiers from the English consul James Frizzell. From Baltimore, he noted that there were 89 women and children and 20 men. There also was an additional 24 English and Irish seamen seized at sea. The next witness report comes from a French Trinitarian priest, Father Pierre Dan. He wrote, "It was a pitiful sight to see them put up for sale. They sold on the one hand husbands, on the other wives, ripping their daughters from their arms, leaving them no hope of ever seeing each other again. Women were subjected to demeaning and intimate inspections. The price ranges depended on whether the girls had practical skills like sewing, or more ominously, whether they were virgins or beautiful, which essentially was code for being wife or concubine material for wealthy men. but the highest prices were reserved for young virgins.
So there were various fortunes for captives who were taken to the Barbary coast. Some of the men who were in better physical condition, and especially if they were talented sailors, might have ended up on the corsair ships in fairly grim circumstances, as chained perpetually and forced to row for a living. Their children would be sent frequently to the Middle East. Some of them would stay locally in the Maghreb, but often they would be brought up elsewhere. Breaking the family connection, and you'd get no further knowledge of or information about where they came from or what ended up with them.
What happened Baltimore after the sack occurred?
The town itself is not fully depopulated, but its economic prosperity is damaged, and even 10 years later we know that there are still disputes over the local territory and over the English Protestant settlers who are still living there at that point.
Why Baltimore?
So I think there's two things to say there. One is that Baltimore was reasonably well connected across the Southern Irish coastal trade networks, and from there also over to England. And then secondly, when it comes to the Barbary corsairs, increasingly in this period they were operating up the Atlantic littoral all the way up to England and Ireland on a fairly regular basis, normally raiding ships rather than raiding the actual coastline this far north. On the approach to Kinsale, local ships were captured, and Murat Reis, who's the corsair captain, is informed by locals that Kinsale is too well protected, and at that point there is a recommendation to head towards Baltimore instead. And Baltimore was never seen to be significant enough to get serious protection from local lords. So they were warned about the threat of pirates attacking even before the raid happened in 1631. But the major concern was Cork and Kinsale, and that's where the troops were established and where the Navy was trying to protect as well.
So what about family connections? Are there any? In Ireland, tracing back one's ancestors to pre-1800 can be a huge challenge. But that doesn't mean that these ancestors didn't exist. And it doesn't mean that we can't speculate.
Very sadly, on that night, 2 people died. One of them is named in the list of those who were killed and abducted as John Davis, spelled D-A-V-Y-S. Davis was a very common planter name in Ireland in the 16th and 17th centuries, all over the island, not just in Munster. And there are lots of Davises around this locality to this very day, all around Baltimore, Skibbereen, Union Hall and so on. And as it so happens, my grandmother's mother was a Davis and her grandmother's grandfather was John Davis. However, it is common enough in this region for people to speculate about their connection with the raid. The name John Davis runs through our family, and I suppose it is tempting to speculate that perhaps this John Davis of the 19th century was descended from the very John Davis who died here on that awful night in 1631.
If anyone is sure about an ancestral connection to these events at Baltimore, please leave a comment, as we'd love to include their story in an update. Speaking of speculation, rumours about a connection between Murat Reis and Humphrey Bogart, plus a possible connection with Jacqueline Kennedy, have been rife. But there is no speculation regarding some of the connections. Many prominent American families, including the Vanderbilts, can trace their roots back to this man. Cornelius Vanderbilt was the pirate's 5th great-grandson. Gloria Vanderbilt was his 9th great-granddaughter. And of course, Gloria's son, Anderson Cooper, is his 10th great-grandson. Murat's 6th great-grandson, Warren Gamaliel Harding, was the 29th President of the United States. A little story from Algiers goes like this. When renowned maritime historian John de Courcy Ireland visited Algiers some years ago, he noticed a child with striking red hair. And naturally, he pondered the possibilities of that boy being a descendant of one of the Baltimore captives. Family history can unearth some very exciting surprises, but it is amazing that a murderous, brutal pirate like Murat Reis is the actual forebear of America's most prominent and influential families, including an American president.